Good afternoon, everyone in Cali, Colombia. Thank you so much for inviting me. Margarita, Jimena, Michael, Grupo de Estudios, everyone who's been working on making this happen for several years. I really, really appreciate hanging in there. I only wish that we could be there together in person, and hopefully that will happen in the near future. Uh, anyway, I'm here virtually, you're there virtually, and I'm making this recording because I'm having a lot of trouble with my internet today. I'm going to say a little bit about the concept of dark matter, which I started to formulate around the year 2000, and then, of course, developed it into several essays and a book. But looking back on that, it might be interesting just to take a quick review of what that was about. And the concept of dark matter really began as an investigation into my own circumstances as a working artist. And this included trying to understand why several art collectives I co-founded in the 1980s and 1990s, that would be political art documentation and distribution with Lucy Lepard, Jerry Kearns, and other people, and then after that, repo history in the 1990s. Why these organizations seem to have almost no footprint within the world of art history or art criticism or in the official art world of museums and institutions. And I really began to examine these emissions and discovered, you might say, a lot more than I had initially bargained for. I thought initially I would just find, okay, this is a matter of correcting the art historical record. What I found instead was a systematic and structural flaw within the idea of art history itself. At least that's how I perceived it at the time. And I don't really think that aspect of it has changed a whole lot. What I realized was there is a vast archive of creative practices that never really receive acknowledgement from the mainstream art world. And I asked, why was that the case? And why do these other practices, uh, what do they do in terms of the art world? Now, that's a question that is traditionally answered with the simple refrain, they do nothing. These other practices, this archive of missing artistic matter, has no real relationship to the art. Classically, people would say, well, if it wasn't good enough to become part of the art historical record or to be collected by museums, then obviously it just wasn't good art, and therefore it doesn't really count. The question that I sort of raised, I kind of put things in different perspective, you might say, and said, well, how does this missing mass, these other practices, how do they help reinforce, reproduce, and manage the art world that we all know and have to relate to on some level? And when I put it in that framework, I began to have a very different concept and picture of what was going on. Uh, the idea that artists struggle in isolation for most of their life, and then they're one day discovered, or they're lost, or they're not, or they're rediscovered. All of those kind of narratives that many of us were taught in traditional art school just didn't seem to really add up and make sense looking at it from this perspective. And that perspective really becomes one of seeing a vast amount of creative production and labor and talent and ideas and creativities and failures and hopes, desires, all of that contributing to the art world that we know, and much of it remaining below the surface, the way most of an iceberg is below the surface, or the way an informal economy helps hold up a real, so-called real formal economy. The metaphor that I landed on uh, though, was dark matter from astrophysics. And in a sense, dark matter, and most of you, I'm sure by now, know this concept, is really the majority of material in the universe. We would say dark matter, maybe and dark energy together constitute over 90% of what the universe is made of. And the problem astrophysicists have is they don't know what it is. It's called dark because it doesn't really reflect light. It doesn't seem to have any physical presence. No one really knows what dark matter is. I looked at the practices of artists who fall between the cracks or in the margins of the art world much in the same way. They are out there, they're contributing to the art world, and they ultimately don't reflect very much light. How do they contribute? Well, let's go back to the metaphor of dark matter. Without dark matter in the universe would actually have no gravitational anchor, and it would have dissipated eons ago. It would have just spread out and dispersed from the so-called Big Bang moment, and there would be just a cold, almost energyless nothing of a universe. The dark matter and the dark energy hold together the universe and keep it sort of anchored. Uh, it's a simplistic idea. I grant you it's a bit science fiction, but I applied this to the art world to say that all of these missing artists, in a sense, and all these missing practices, and all this missing creativity are what really anchor and reproduce the art world that we know. But perhaps the most important part of my thesis was that, in fact, dark matter was not dark anymore. It was getting brighter and brighter and brighter, and that was happening in the 1990s in particular for a couple of reasons. One was the internet, no question about it. That has allowed practices that were once on the very margins of visibility to sort of connect up, to share information, to thicken, to produce kind of online communities, to make their presence known. That aspect of it was very important. But there's another aspect of it, and that is that neoliberal capitalism, or ultra-free market capitalism, or deregulated capitalism, however you want to put it, is desperately searching for value in places that it never looked before. This would get us back to some degree to the Italian theorist Mario Tronti's idea of the social factory. You know, what happens when capitalism can't extract value from the factory floor, from factory production, the social relations that go on in a factory situation where the workers go, they do their job, and then they go home. They're really disconnected from the capitalist system. In the social factory, Tronti theorized, this process, this reach of capitalism begins to stretch into the home, into the everyday world, into the society that was once separated from the factory floor, thus the idea of a social factory. And if you expand that idea today, I think there's not a single person that I'm speaking to now who wouldn't say, yes, my life is completely sort of interpenetrated or invaded by the business that I have to do, the production that I have to do, the sort of consumption that I'm participating in, the advertising that comes to me. In a sense, even our relationship now vis-a-vis this online technology is, in a sense, something similar. You're not going to a lecture hall or a university to see me speak. It's coming into your home. And I have no doubt many of you are either getting instructions or teaching or doing your business in the same way during this pandemic lockdown, which has really just exacerbated, in a sense, this idea of the social factory. So for me, dark matter was getting brighter for both of those reasons, both because it was possible technologically to do it, but also because the system of capitalism that we all live within in a hegemonic way was desperately looking for new content, areas of value that it could extract, value from, areas of productivity it could extract value from. And this is the combination that I saw when I said that basically dark matter is getting brighter. What did that mean? Well, it didn't necessarily mean good things. I want to talk about the good things, but I also want to acknowledge that from the very beginning, it meant that regressive, racist, xenophobic, misogynist, even authoritarian kinds of thinking, groups of people who had been isolated and rather sort of separated from the mainstream were now able to sort of connect and transform themselves into an actual force. And I think we have seen that demonstrated in a unbelievable way, particularly over the last 4, 5, 6 years. In some parts of the world, it's been, of course, going on longer. In other parts of the world, including in Colombia and other countries, what we've seen in Brazil, what we've seen in the United Kingdom, and of course what we see here in the United States. I have no doubt that this thickening and brightening of dark matter, of a certain kind of dark matter, I have no doubt that that has contributed to that possibility of authoritarianism. On the positive side, this brightening of dark matter has also allowed collectives, artist collectives, progressive artist collectives, activist artists, people doing socially engaged art to find each other, to find new ways of working together, to become more visible. And in turn, the art world has certainly responded. We see now museums, incorporating the idea of socially engaged art or social practice into their programming. It's happening mostly through education programs, but it's definitely a real factor today. And of course, it's happening at the academic level, the university level, and so on and so forth. It's an interesting moment. It's not without its contradictions and its problems, but we have to be, in these days, looking, I think, for the positive in what's going on. I want to talk about the current conditions under this sort of rubric of monumenticide, that is, the taking down of monuments, and also a concept that I'm developing called the unpresent, or the uncanny unpresent. Let me just offer two quotes initially. One is from Mark Fisher, the late Mark Fisher theorist, who, among other books, wrote Capitalist Realism. And he says that the turn from beliefs to aesthetics, from engagement to spectatorship, is held to be one of the virtues of capitalist realism. And for Mark Fisher, the idea that capitalism has so dominated our lives, we can't imagine an escape from it or a space outside of it, that it becomes all-consuming. And it's a rather depressing view of things. And I want to counter Mark Fisher's idea of capitalist realism with Antonio Gramsci, who wrote many decades ago, "The old is dying and the new cannot be born." And in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. So we have a tension between what seems to be a completely dominating situation, not just of capitalism as we've known it since the Second World War, but now of a kind of nationalist, authoritarian capitalism. But on the other hand, something is trying to be born, I believe completely that Gramsci's words apply to the moment. Let's just take a look at a couple things. I'm going to read a little text for you and also be presenting some visuals. Over the past few months, the world has watched in astonishment as racially insensitive public monuments directly or indirectly supporting white supremacy, have been dethroned, toppled over, deformed, beheaded, tossed in streams and harbors, and always left with a coating of graffiti in bold and garish spray paint colors on their base. Two things to note here. One is, yes, there have been some monuments taken down that were not monuments or sculptures or statues to white supremacists, including several abolitionists, and others have been attacked. I think that's worth considering and why that's taking place. The second point is that the graffiti that we often see that's left behind after the monument's taken away is, of course, on the sort of base or the plinth that the sculpture stood on. And it's an interesting idea to think these sort of bases remain. They remain visible, and sometimes they're reused for a completely different idea of what history is or how it should be represented. We find that sculptures, sculpted figures that seemed permanently fused to the landscape are now just empty, and instead we see the words George Floyd or Black Lives Matter imprinted on them, spray painted on them. Long in demand by some and now acted upon by many, these acts of destructive rectification or creative vandalism, if you will, across cities and towns in the United States and beyond, in Europe and other parts of the world, Latin America, as you know, these actions are frequently accompanied by calls for the decolonization of culture, including museums and other kinds of institutions. Permeating these heterogeneous public congregations are forms of activism with roots in collectives from the 1980s and 90s, such as Grand Fury or the Guerrilla Girls, or even later Occupy movement of the 2011-2012 and Arab Spring era, the Indignados and so forth in Spain. Cultural modes, these are cultural modes that fundamentally change and challenge the category of art as much as they do political activism. And my point being that these kinds of collective actions by artists also infect and change the way activists operate, and vice versa. But why is this taking place now, and why is visual representation, or better yet, misrepresentation or disrepresentation, situated at the center of so much of this activity, this kind of political unrest? Or will all of this eventually settle down, returning to normality? So many public officials would like that to happen, business owners and politicians and cultural leaders, hoping we return to normal. Although it seems like that may, in fact, be completely impossible. And as we all experience the effects of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the quarantine, we, I think, are coming to realize that the world that we knew before is probably never going to return. For most of the commentators about these takedowns of sculptures and statues and memorials, we could say the current tide of monumenticide and similar spectacles of mass dissent are symptoms of frustration with structural racism, with the unsettled ideological debts over national identity, and with failed political leadership, but also with the cultural history that's inherited by a new generation, who are really skeptical of the promises of the past. And this, in a sense, loops back to my dark matter thesis, the idea that those who've been in the margins and on the fringes of culture just don't see themselves reflected in it and are now demanding that that take place. That might be, at least in part, an explanation for why some of the statues and memorials that have been taken down were not of racist leaders, but were even of people who had been quite liberal or, in a sense, abolitionists and so forth. These actions also seem akin in spirit, if not also sometimes in tactical sort of approach, with the trenchant critique of cultural institutions over the past decade called institutional critique. And it's interesting to sort of maybe think about the similarities and contrasts between the practice of institutional critique that many of us have learned through the realm of the arts in the last, let's say, 30 so years, with what's going on in the streets, especially post George Floyd and other situations with Black Lives Matter and other organizations. But it's been going on, of course, and you know this as well as I, in Latin America and other places for decades. The one area where I'd see these things overlap, and it's worth thinking about this, is in the United States in particular, there's been a wave of attempts to unionize the museum staff at major museums. If I'm not mistaken, it began at the New Museum where I once worked. It moved on to the Guggenheim, it moved on to museums on the West Coast, and it's now happening in Philadelphia and other major museums, been happening, and it was reaching its peak just as the COVID epidemic took hold. What's happened since is these museums have gone into a financial collapse. partial financial collapse. In the United States, that's largely because they are dependent on individual donors, but also on people coming into the museum and paying the fee. And there's all kinds of reasons why it's a very different structure, let's say, than Europe and probably most of Latin America. But they have been laying off, the museums have been laying off a lot of workers, and they seem to be targeting the people who led these unionization campaigns. What I want to say, though, about this in relationship to institutional critique is that many of the people involved in the unionization movement that we've seen here in the United States in the museums are themselves artists, or in some cases, maybe people who studied art history. And in other words, they actually recognized and understood the lessons of institutional critique in, I think, a very profoundly different way than those well-known artists such as Hans Haacke or Andrea Fraser or others who created works of art that critique the institution, inside the gallery, museum spaces. These union workers who studied art and art history are actually carrying out a kind of institutional critique at a completely different level of institutional reality within the organizational structure of these museums themselves. I think that's an important shift, and it's not happening entirely from the inside of the museum. As I pointed out before, all of the activism that's going on in the streets around Black Lives Matter and other groups, Decolonize This Place, other organizations, have also put pressure on these institutions, you might say, from the outside. There's of course overlap between the inside and the outside, but you could think about this as two forces. One inside, almost a kind of mutiny amongst the staff and the people in the museums, coming together with forces from the outside that are critiquing the society and its white supremacy and its class structure and its misogyny. So this is a very interesting moment, powerful moment, and we shouldn't be completely negative despite all of the things we're facing, both at the biological level and at the political level, which are very, very serious and complicated. What I want to just turn to a second now is the question of capitalist realism that I brought up before, what Mark Fisher called capitalist realism. And I want to suggest that what he was talking about in the 1990s, that is this kind of domination of post-socialist capitalism, right? So we have the fall of actually existing socialism in most of the world. Of course, it still exists in a few locations, but we have the fall of USSR, of Eastern Europe, and so forth. And then capitalism becomes the dominant form of not just economics, but of society. And it sort of approaches this as if this is a normalization, right? We're returning to some kind of normal, that as if socialism was this aberration that we had to get rid of. Not only is it a normalization that where capitalism becomes hegemonic, but there's also an aestheticization of society. Suddenly, everything about politics is also about a kind of cultural relationship to it, pivoting completely on the idea of consumption, of the commodity, brands, lifestyles, and so on and so forth, including art, the small corner of reality that we inhabit. According to Mark Fisher in Capitalist Realism, all alternatives to the system, or so we are led to believe, have either failed or are now incorporated into capital's spectacularized commodification, including lifestyle choices, and we can think here of, say, counterculture, punk, hip-hop, goth. These are just some of the examples. It seems that capital can absorb almost anything, maybe not quite everything. Capital also absorbs and appropriates and subsumes contemporary art practices. And I would say this is a concept that made me think about Giorgio Agamben's idea of bare life, that we could apply that to the art world and talk about a bare art world, one in which we no longer see art world covering for a system that stands behind it, a system of capital, but also of colonialism uh, and imperialism in many cases. It's just absolutely transparent now that the art world, the official art world, uh, is in, you might say, cahoots with this kind of hegemony. It's very hard to separate the two. And so this concept of bare art, which I borrow from Giorgio Agamben, and I apologize to him for that, it really talks about the fact that the contradictions that we've all experienced if we deal with the art world are now completely on the surface level. We experience a bare art world, if you will. And the sort of artistic bad consciousness, in a sense, is now normalized and taken for granted. Uh, in a weird way, it reflects what's going on in the White House in this country. Right? Nobody's pretending that what's going on is in any way anything other than the exercise of raw power and racism. It's impossible to sort of pretend that that's not the nature of the administration we're dealing with. I don't want to put that heavy a claim on what's going on in the art world, so let's not go to that extreme. But I would say that bare art might say survives one step beyond Theodore Adorno's bleak assessment of cultural compromise. Remember his critique of Jean-Paul Sartre and of Bertolt Brecht, that their idea of commitment, the idea of committed art, was really problematic, because what art does, what's so subversive about art, according to Adorno, is that by its form alone, it really subverts our sense of normalcy and of capitalist hegemony and so on and so forth. You don't need to inject content or solidarity with political opposition. You don't need to do that because art is just so powerful in its own sense. And of course, he uses someone like Samuel Beckett or Arnold Schoenberg or Franz Kafka as an example of how art can really be unnerving to a system of normalcy. And here I mean normalcy in all the ways that normalcy can cover for what we might say is really abnormal. But I would say bare art goes beyond Adorno's position, and it evolves not into representation of capital, really, nor of capital in its commodity stage, but into capital itself. That art has become, to some degree, in some sectors, capital. Contemporary art conspicuously entwines itself with the laws of economic value production, and therefore also with the chronic and ever more rapidly reoccurring political crisis of global capitalism. And by that I mean that you have people certainly in the United States and in the UK, where I've done most of my research, policymakers calling on the fact that there's overproduction of art. There's too many artists and too much art being made, and it can't be supported. You can't economically or in policy matters support this kind of overproduction. So it has to be sort of throttled back, as if the art world and its production system were simply a kind of capitalist engine of production. And we could have this debate probably extensively, and maybe in the Q&A we could do that, about whether art is completely subsumed within capital. I mean artistic production, of course. And there are those who say that's absolutely not possible, such as David Beach in the UK, and there's others like Marina Wishmet who would say that has happened already. I take a position closer to Wishmet, and we can unfold that some other time, but what's important now for me is to express this idea of bare art, that whether it's an actual subsumption or whether it's just a kind of formal subsumption, the art world clearly is now part of the capitalist system in a very profound way. And yet you would say, well, now we're really doomed. There's absolutely no way to resist, right? And I would say that's actually not the case at all. And you can see this on many levels, but in one sense, this wave of labor organizing within the art museum world and the institutional art world reflects the fact that people no longer have illusions that what they're doing is somehow for the greater good, even if they're not paid well, even if they're treated very badly. They're rising to some much more important cultural and social sort of function. I think people have largely abandoned that and are recognizing that in a bare art world, what you're doing is working for an institution and you should be paid well. I'm reminded of Bertolt Brecht's funny remark about the idea that, when the actor walks across the stage, he or she or they are thinking, not only am I playing the role, whatever, Macbeth or whomever, but I'm also getting paid to do this job, right? This kind of dual thinking. And I think that's become very, very visible, and I talk about that as kind of bare art world. The bare art world inevitably transforms us. We who are its really social productive forces, and I talk about that now as an artist and as a sort of art thinker and writer. We were once upon a time kind of invisible within plain sight, at least most of us. And that would be the dark matter thesis, that dark matter was never really invisible. It was always right there in front of us. The person who's putting up the wall for the exhibition, the person who's cleaning the floor, the person who's packing the art so it can be shipped to another location, the person who's teaching another generation of artists, and on and on and on. All of that was very visible. It's just we didn't see it. Not we didn't see it, but the art world wouldn't see it and often blinded us to it. This is a kind of weak force, you might say. A weak force, but a strong portion. Because of its massive size, it becomes a strong force. And I would say that the subsumed conditions of bare cultural and political reality are playing off against the authoritarian leadership that we find now in many countries. And we see it inside these art institutions as well, because there's been a whole wave now of criticism against museums, not just about the fact that they are not treating workers well financially with their wages, but also that there's microaggression, censorship, and racism and misogyny going on inside these institutions. In other words, the boards of these institutions and sometimes the leadership have a toxicity to them. And that's something people are challenging as well. So bringing these ideas together, on the one hand, this concept of bare art, and on the other, the idea of capitalist realism that Mark Fisher developed really in the 1990s, I want to say that at the moment we're experiencing something quite a transformation of these things, not a difference, but I think an extreme version of it. And I would call that the unpresent. And in a sense, the unpresent is a distinct mutation of capitalist realism. It's a situation in which the system no longer presents itself in any way, shape, or form as normal, or not even as like a detour from normality that will soon wind its way back to familiar terrain. The unpresent offers us only a pathological reality. It's an unmappable, endlessly repeating now time, and it's delirious and crisis-ridden, and it's constant, and it's infecting our ideas of culture, self-identity, national identity, and of course, art. And this is, I think, the situation we find ourselves in at the moment. What is troubling us and what is making things so difficult is that we wake up every day and the world looks the same as it did before, and it looks completely different and upside down from the way it looks before. And it doesn't feel like that will ever actually change anymore, that sense of a completely inverted reality, a kind of Alice in Wonderland looking glass reality. Right? Nevertheless, I think that this is the moment when the Black Lives Matter movement, monumenticide, the takedown of monuments and statues to questionable racist and other political leaders of the past, this breaks through to some degree, opens up some possibility of thinking about the future. Because one of the aspects of the uncanny unpresent is that it really represses our idea of thinking of a future, or thinking of the future as a possibility. even as something that is in the future. The very idea of futurity itself seems to be sort of repressed within it, as is the past. Suddenly we can no longer think about moments in the past when there were actual differences with capitalism, when there were uprisings, when there was something that took place that was not subsumed within the idea of capitalist realism. And this is the unpresent at its extreme. The past, the future, both become forbidden and inaccessible to us, except in this brief lacuna, this strange moment brought on by the COVID, brought on by the killings of so many African American people in the United States, but elsewhere, treatment of immigrants, treatment of indigenous people, of former political leaders and former political movements by a very authoritarian, repressive government, and governments and ideas and thinking about the society that has moved in a direction that's extremely sort of conservative, even reactionary. But we have this pushback, this moment when a monument comes down, when someone calls out, say her name, when we see mass mobilization of marginalized people who are demanding justice and demanding freedom. In a way, in this context of the unpresent, I think it has a profound effect in at least tearing a little tiny hole in that sense that there is no past and there is no future. It tears a little hole that opens up the possibility, at least to begin to think about what that might be, what might be else, what might not be capitalism, what might not be this uncanny present. And I think it's also happening within the realm of the fine arts, and that's where we are located. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.